The rain came down in silver sheets, turning the quiet afternoon into a blur of gray shadows and trembling reflections. Rowan Hale stood beneath the porch of the old farmhouse he had inherited from his grandfather, watching the storm swallow the road. It had been 3 years since he had lost everything that made life feel meaningful. 3 years since laughter had disappeared from those weathered walls. 3 years since loneliness had become his most faithful companion. Then he saw her. A young woman stood at the edge of the property, soaked by the rain, carrying a worn backpack that looked heavier than her entire future. She hesitated before approaching, as if she had already been turned away too many times before. The wind whipped through her dark hair, and even from a distance Rowan could see exhaustion written across her face. If you believe kindness and second chances can change lives, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Your support helps spread stories that remind us of the power of compassion. The woman climbed the porch steps slowly. Rainwater dripped from her sleeves and pooled around her shoes. For a moment neither of them spoke. The storm filled the silence. Then she finally looked up and asked the question that would change both their lives forever. She asked if there was room. Rowan stared at her. Most people would have simply said yes or no. But something about her eyes stopped him. They carried a sadness he recognized because he saw the same sadness in his own reflection every morning. Without thinking, he replied with a strange question of his own. What if she wanted to stay forever? The woman blinked in surprise. For the first time that day, a tiny smile appeared on her face. Her name was Tessa Vale. Rowan learned that she had spent months moving from town to town, taking temporary jobs wherever she could find them. Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father had disappeared shortly afterward. Foster homes, shelters, and uncertainty had become her normal life. She never expected permanence anymore. She never unpacked completely because she had learned that staying never lasted. Yet as Rowan handed her a towel and showed her the small guest room upstairs, something unfamiliar settled inside her chest. Hope. The farmhouse wasn't impressive. The paint was peeling. The roof needed repairs. The porch creaked whenever someone walked across it. But it felt warm. It felt safe. That night, while rain tapped softly against the windows, Rowan sat alone in the kitchen remembering how different life used to be. Years earlier, he had shared that house with his wife, Maeve. They had dreamed of raising children there. They had planted flowers together. They had planned decades of memories. Then a car accident took her away in a single terrible moment. Since then, Rowan had simply existed. He maintained the farm because it gave him something to do. He woke up because morning arrived. He survived because breathing was automatic. But living was something he had forgotten. Across the hall, Tessa sat on the edge of the guest bed staring at the ceiling. She should have felt nervous about staying with a stranger. Instead, she felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering where she would sleep tomorrow. Days passed, then weeks. Tessa offered to help around the property in exchange for staying. Rowan agreed. Together they repaired fences damaged by storms. They cleared weeds from neglected flower beds. They painted old wooden railings beneath endless blue skies. Little by little, life returned to the farmhouse. Neighbors began noticing the changes. The abandoned garden started blooming again. The windows stayed open. Music occasionally drifted from the kitchen. The old house looked alive. And so did Rowan. One afternoon, while sorting through dusty boxes in the attic, Tessa discovered dozens of photographs. Pictures of Rowan and Maeve. Birthday celebrations, summer picnics, holiday gatherings, a lifetime frozen inside fading photographs. When Rowan found Tessa looking through them, he expected the familiar ache of grief. Instead, he felt gratitude. For years he had hidden those memories because they hurt too much. Now he could finally look at them again. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun painted the horizon gold. Neither spoke much. Neither needed to. Some silences heal instead of hurting. Yet life rarely allows happiness to arrive without testing it first. One morning, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Two sharply dressed men stepped out. Tessa's face instantly lost color. The fear in her eyes startled Rowan. The men explained they represented a development company interested in purchasing surrounding farmland. They had already bought several neighboring properties and wanted Rowan's land as well. The offer was enormous, far more money than the farm was worth. Most people would have accepted immediately. But Rowan refused. The farm wasn't just land. It was memory. It was history. It was home. The men left politely, but their smiles carried a warning. Weeks later, strange things began happening. Property markers appeared near the edge of Rowan's fields. Surveyors visited repeatedly. Rumors spread through town that the area would soon be transformed into commercial developments. Pressure mounted from every direction. Friends encouraged him to sell. Financial advisors called him foolish. Even some neighbors accused him of standing in the way of progress. The stress weighed heavily on Rowan. Meanwhile, Tessa faced struggles of her own. Though she had found safety, she constantly battled the voice inside her head that insisted she didn't deserve it. Years of rejection had taught her not to trust happiness. Every good thing eventually disappeared. Every person eventually left. Some nights she packed her backpack halfway before convincing herself to stay until morning. The scars of abandonment ran deep. One evening Rowan found her sitting alone near the barn. The sunset cast long shadows across the fields. Tessa looked lost, not physically, emotionally, as if she stood between the life she had survived and the life she wanted but didn't believe she deserved. Rowan sat beside her. The conversation that followed lasted hours. By the end of it, both understood something important. Pain changes people, but it doesn't have to define them. That realization became a turning point. Tessa stopped viewing herself as temporary. Rowan stopped viewing himself as broken. And together they began imagining a future neither had considered before. Months passed. The farmhouse became a gathering place for people who needed help. Travelers, single parents, elderly neighbors, teenagers struggling through difficult situations. No one stayed permanently, but everyone left feeling seen, feeling valued, feeling human. Word spread. The house gained an unofficial reputation throughout the county. People called it Haven Farm. A place where kindness still existed. A place where doors remained open. A place where second chances weren't just possible, they were expected. Yet the development company had not forgotten Rowan's refusal. One autumn afternoon a legal notice arrived. A new highway project threatened to cut through part of his land. The paperwork was complicated. The deadlines were intimidating. The situation felt impossible. Rowan spent sleepless nights studying documents. Tessa worked beside him. Together they attended town meetings. They spoke with lawyers. They gathered support from neighbors. What surprised everyone was how many people came forward to help. Former visitors returned. Families Rowan had assisted appeared unexpectedly. Individuals whose lives had been touched by Haven Farm stood beside him. The kindness he had given away for years came back multiplied. At a crowded community hearing, story after story filled the room. A widow explained how Haven Farm helped her through grief. A young man described finding direction after months of homelessness. A family shared how temporary shelter at the farmhouse helped them rebuild their lives. The room grew emotional. People weren't defending a piece of land. They were defending what it represented. Hope, connection, humanity. Weeks later, officials announced revisions to the project plans. The farmhouse and most of the property would remain untouched. The community celebrated. For Rowan, the victory meant more than saving land. It proved that kindness leaves footprints. Even when you cannot see them. Even when years pass. Even when you think nobody remembers. Winter arrived gently that year. Snow covered the fields like a blanket of white silence. Inside the farmhouse, warmth and laughter filled every room. One evening Rowan stood by the window watching snowflakes drift through the darkness. He thought about the stormy afternoon when Tessa first arrived. One question had changed everything. Was there room? The answer, he realized, had never been about physical space. It had been about emotional space. The willingness to let someone matter. The courage to care again. The decision to believe that hearts can expand even after being shattered. Nearby, Tessa decorated the living room for a community gathering. She moved through the house with confidence now. Not like a guest, not like someone waiting to leave. Like someone who belonged. Because she did. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Stories like these remind us that a single act of kindness can create ripples that travel farther than we ever imagine. Years later, visitors would often ask how Haven Farm began. They expected a grand story. A heroic moment. Something dramatic. Instead, the answer was beautifully simple. It began with one exhausted traveler standing in the rain. It began with one lonely man opening a door. It began with a question. Before we reach the ending, please comment. There is always room for kindness. Your words may inspire someone reading the comments today. On the anniversary of the day Tessa arrived, the community gathered once again at the farmhouse. Children ran across the fields. Neighbors shared meals. Laughter echoed through the halls. The house no longer felt haunted by loss. It felt alive with purpose. As evening settled over the countryside, golden sunlight stretched across the porch where everything had started. Rowan stood quietly watching the celebration. His heart felt full, not because life had become perfect, not because pain had disappeared, but because he finally understood something his grandfather once told him long ago. A home is not measured by its size. It is measured by how many people leave it feeling loved. Tessa joined him on the porch. Below them, dozens of lives mingled together because one act of kindness had connected them all. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. For a moment, Rowan imagined Maeve smiling somewhere beyond the horizon. Not sad, not gone, simply part of every good thing that continued to grow. The rainstorm that had brought Tessa years earlier felt like another lifetime. Yet its lesson remained. Sometimes the people who arrive unexpectedly become the family we never knew we needed. Sometimes healing enters our lives disguised as a stranger, asking for help, and sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the most extraordinary legacies. As darkness settled softly over Haven Farm, lights glowed warmly through every window, welcoming anyone searching for shelter, hope, or simply a reminder that they mattered. Because in a world that often feels cold and uncertain, there will always be room for kindness. And for those brave enough to offer it, there will always be room for love to stay forever.